The air was sharp with frost that morning, boots crunching against gravel as the column of weary men shuffled forward. A guard tower loomed above, searchlights still dim from the night, barbed wire catching the first glint of sunrise. German POWs, captured in Europe and ferried across an ocean they never thought they'd see, now filed through wooden gates into an American camp. Every step was heavy with dread. They had been told, by their officers, by rumors in the trenches, that capture by the Allies meant starvation, humiliation, and slow death. Yet here they were, alive, guarded, but not beaten. The uncertainty was worse than the march. A clipboard shut as an American sergeant ticked off numbers, 312 arrivals, one column of prisoners added to the camp's swelling population. By 1944, there were an estimated 370,000 German POWs scattered across the United States alone, an invisible army behind barbed wire. The war machine that produced Sherman tanks and B-17 bombers also had space, wood, and manpower to build entire small cities just to house its enemies. Inside the perimeter, tar paper barracks lined up in neat rows, smoke curling from stovepipes. To men accustomed to mud, ruined villages, and collapsing bunkers, the sight of intact roofs felt surreal. They were still captives, yet the environment lacked the brutality they had braced for. "We thought they would starve us, the way our own men starved their captives," one prisoner later recalled. That thought carried a quiet bitterness. Guards watched silently as the newcomers shuffled past. Some prisoners scanned the barracks, others fixed their eyes on the gravel at their feet, unwilling to risk a glance at the armed Americans. The only sounds were boots, coughs, and the metallic rattle of canteens. Hunger gnawed at them, real, physical hunger. Some hadn't eaten properly since before capture. The question pressed into every stomach: what food, if any, would come through those gates? In that moment of fear, the camp seemed more prison than refuge. The wire stretched endlessly, the towers shadowed every movement. For the Germans, hunger was the sharpest weapon they expected to face. But just beyond the wire, supply trucks were already rolling, engines rumbling, loaded with wooden crates stamped with a bold emblem, the Red Cross. The men did not know it yet, but their dread of hunger was about to collide with an abundance they could never have imagined.
Engines grumbled at the far side of the wire, their low roar cutting through the cold air. Prisoners looked up, eyes narrowing against the glare as trucks rolled into view. They were not armored transports, not troop carriers, but civilian-style flatbeds stacked with wooden crates. The crates bore a simple, bold emblem, the Red Cross, painted in thick strokes that seemed almost theatrical against the weathered planks. Guards moved briskly, shouting orders, and began unloading them in neat rows on the gravel yard. The prisoners exchanged quick glances, skeptical, tight-lipped. Some muttered under their breath, "Propaganda, a trick." The memory of hunger was still raw, and rumors in Europe had warned them that Americans would break their spirit through neglect. Yet these crates did not look like weapons of despair. They looked like shipments of supplies, organized, official, and oddly generous. As the lids were pried open, the truth spilled out. Parcels, individually wrapped, labeled, and counted. Inside, a mix that read like fantasy to starving men. Canned meat, tins of milk, coffee, cigarettes, soap. And at the bottom, glinting like treasure in silver foil, the unmistakable bars of American chocolate. Reports indicate that by late 1943, millions of such parcels were distributed across Allied POW camps. For the Germans watching this first delivery, the number might as well have been infinite. One prisoner later recalled, "We thought it was theater, like a stage show for our benefit. But then the chocolate appeared. You cannot fake that. The first bar was tossed onto a table with casual indifference by a guard, who seemed unaware of the storm it created in the men's minds. Fingers reached hesitantly, as if expecting it to vanish. The foil crackled under the touch, a sound louder than any speech. Skepticism began to crumble. The emblem on the crates was no trick, it was a lifeline. Here was something that tasted of civilian life, of home, of peace, things none of them believed existed anymore. But more shocking still was the idea that their enemy's system had the surplus to feed not just its soldiers, not just its people, but also its captives. The Red Cross crates stood like silent witnesses to an unthinkable truth. In America, even prisoners would not starve. And inside those foil wrappers lay a sweetness that would redefine captivity itself, setting the stage for a revelation deeper than food, the taste of chocolate as a symbol of abundance.
The mess hall smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wood, but every eye in the room was fixed on one thing. An American guard, leaning casually against the table, pulled a Hershey bar from his pocket. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it onto the scarred wooden surface. It landed with a soft thud, its silver foil glinting under the hanging bulb. Silence fell, the kind of silence that pressed against eardrums. For German POWs who had gone weeks on thin bread and watery soup, the sight was unreal. No one reached for it at first. Fingers hovered, withdrew, hovered again. The act of unwrapping it seemed almost dangerous, too bold, too hopeful. Finally, one prisoner let his thumb slide along the crimped edge of the foil. The sound, sharp, metallic, almost musical, cut through the air. Every man leaned closer, drawn to it like moths to flame. The smell followed. Sweetness, heavy and foreign in a room where salt pork usually set the tone. For many, it was the first taste of chocolate since the war began. For some, it was their first taste ever. According to Red Cross records, a single parcel often included 4 to 6 chocolate bars, plus gum, canned meat, and even powdered milk. Each parcel weighed about 11 pounds, designed not just for calories, but for morale. A prisoner later admitted in his diary, "I had never tasted such sweetness in war." That first bite carried more than sugar. It carried memory of bakeries in Cologne, of childhood birthdays, of ordinary life before rubble and ruin. The guard, chewing his own piece with complete indifference, might as well have been a character from another planet, a world where abundance was casual, not miraculous. The bar was broken into squares, passed hand to hand with a kind of reverence usually reserved for relics. Every man savored the slow melt, delaying the swallow as long as possible. For a few minutes, the war seemed to dissolve on their tongues. But the bigger shock came not from the taste itself, but from the scale implied. If this was just one parcel, one truckload, one camp, how many bars were out there? That question gnawed harder than hunger ever had, pulling their thoughts beyond the foil wrapper and toward the staggering numbers waiting just outside the wire. Outside the wire, the truth roared on rubber tires. Convoys stretched across highways, trucks stacked high with crates, moving in disciplined columns, engines coughing in rhythm. The scale was almost invisible from the yard, but the prisoners sensed it in every delivery. Chocolate wasn't a trick, it wasn't a rare indulgence, it was part of a system so vast it bent belief. Factories in Pennsylvania and Illinois churned out rations day and night, feeding not only American soldiers on 3 continents, but also the men behind barbed wire who had once tried to kill them. Numbers began to circulate inside the camps, whispered like forbidden news. 3 million chocolate bars, delivered into prisoner circuits through the International Red Cross. Reports indicated that by mid-1944, the flow of parcels was so steady that Allied officials measured them not in crates, but in freight cars. To a German infantryman who had counted bullets before an assault, the arithmetic was crushing. "How could they afford to waste this on us?" one prisoner muttered, staring at the foil in his hands. It was not really waste, of course. The parcels were tightly managed under Geneva Convention agreements. But perception mattered more than paperwork. To men raised under ration cards and shortages, the sight of abundance for captives alone was staggering. The industrial logic was merciless in its clarity. If America could spare trucks, ships, and trains for chocolate, what could it do when the cargo was tanks, aircraft, or fuel? Each square of sweetness became a silent statistic, proof that the enemy's economy was fighting a war on two fronts, destroying cities abroad while supplying civility at home. The irony dug deep. In Germany, rumors told of Red Cross parcels intercepted, shrunk, or delayed until only crumbs remained. Here, by contrast, the parcels piled high, sometimes stacked in orderly towers before distribution. The message was unspoken but unmistakable. Production, not just firepower, was the true weapon. The prisoners felt the weight of that realization every time another truck rolled in. It was not just hunger being answered, it was morale being dismantled. Each delivery marked the difference between two systems, one collapsing under shortages, the other overflowing with supplies. The shock would only sharpen when men compared this abundance with what their own captured comrades endured inside Germany's camps, where food was scarce and survival was uncertain.
The foil wrappers crinkled in American camps, but across Europe, different sounds marked captivity. The scrape of tin spoons against nearly empty bowls, the hollow echo of hunger. Smuggled letters and whispered testimonies told a darker story. German-run POW camps where food was scarce, rations cut to survival minimums, and morale broken under the weight of hunger. Prisoners there counted every potato slice, every crumb of black bread, hoping the next day would bring enough to stand. For German soldiers inside Allied custody, the shock was unbearable. Here, parcels came with canned meat, coffee, and even cigarettes. But their own comrades, captured on the Eastern Front or even in France, received watery turnip soup and little else. Reports indicate that by 1945, rations for Allied prisoners under German control sometimes dropped to as little as 700 to 900 calories a day. Survival often depended on smuggling, bribery, or sheer endurance. The comparison became a constant topic, whispered late at night in barracks. Some men admitted aloud what others could not. "We are treated better here than our own captured soldiers." The irony was sharp, cutting deeper than any barbed wire. These were men raised on propaganda that promised German honor and discipline, only to find dignity offered by their enemies. The letters smuggled back to families revealed this dissonance. Mothers in bombed-out cities read carefully phrased lines. "Do not worry, we are being fed." The censors clipped most of the detail, but even the bland words carried suspicion. How could their sons gain weight in captivity while they themselves rationed bread? Some dismissed it as exaggeration, others suspected betrayal. Inside the camps, comparisons became survival stories in themselves. A man would recall his brother in a stalag under German guards, surviving on crusts. Another would shake his head at the canned milk in his hand. The shame was quiet, but it spread. Abundance was no longer just nourishment, it was a weapon of contrast, showing prisoners the weakness of the system they had once fought for. And yet, in the middle of that vast imbalance,
it was not only crates and statistics that changed minds. The true shock often came in the smallest gestures, moments when an American guard or fellow prisoner extended kindness that couldn't be explained by logistics alone.
It wasn't always the crates that broke through suspicion. Sometimes it was a match strike in the dark. On night watch, an American guard leaned down, cupped his hand against the wind, and lit a cigarette for a German prisoner. No speeches, no exchange of words, just the glow of tobacco shared between enemies. In the silence, the gesture felt heavier than any delivery truck. Inside the barracks, the same quiet moments repeated. Under the dim buzz of a single bulb, chocolate squares were split and passed hand to hand, prisoners trading bites for small favors, a sharpened pencil, a borrowed jacket, a whispered story from the front. Parcels supplied the goods, but it was the human act of sharing that transformed them. Statistics tell the larger story. By 1944, the Red Cross was moving 24,000 parcels a day across Europe, a logistical lifeline that dwarfed anything the Axis could offer. Yet numbers alone don't explain the weight of a guard handing over a chocolate bar with a shrug, or a medic slipping an extra tin of milk to a man with hollow cheeks. These moments traveled faster than rumor. They were not the monsters we were told, one POW admitted years later. His voice carried both relief and shame. Relief that captivity brought dignity. Shame that belief in German superiority had cracked over something as simple as a sweet. The exchanges multiplied into an informal language. A square of chocolate meant trust. A cigarette offered meant peace, even for a minute. And in those gestures, the divide between captor and captive blurred, replaced by something older than uniforms, the basic instinct to acknowledge another human being. Still, beneath the kindness lay questions. Why treat enemies with this level of respect? Was it discipline, propaganda, or genuine compassion? The prisoners could not agree, but they all felt its power in the warmth of a shared smoke or the taste of a sweet that arrived from nowhere. These small gestures became the mortar holding together camp life, bridging days of monotony and despair. And as the rituals spread, they built not just survival networks, but cultures, miniature societies with their own rules, trades, and even art. From cigarettes and chocolate, the camps grew something unexpected, a fragile but thriving culture behind wire. By winter, the chocolate had become more than food. It was currency, traded like coins across the barracks. A square could buy a song, a sketch, or a carved chess piece shaped from scrap wood. What began as survival items turned into tokens of art, music, and even laughter. The barracks, once silent with suspicion, now buzzed with quiet deals struck under the hum of dim lights. Prisoners crafted guitars out of crates, violins strung with salvaged wire, and drums hammered from empty tins. Chocolate was the payment, the oil that kept the gears of this miniature society turning. Some men hoarded it as wealth, others gave it away freely, watching friendships form in the shadow of wire. Records show that certain camps hosted full orchestras by 1944, instruments acquired through barter, Red Cross shipments, or hand-built ingenuity. A square of cocoa could buy a violin string. A full bar could buy a performance in the crowded mess hall. To men whose world had shrunk to fences and schedules, this culture felt like stolen freedom. One prisoner later admitted, "We built a life out of their generosity." He wasn't just speaking of parcels, but of the way they allowed humanity to leak back into a space designed to confine. Guards tolerated the trading, even smirked at it, knowing it softened tempers and kept order. The chocolate economy extended beyond art. Chessboards carved from scrap wood became battlegrounds where prisoners wagered pieces of foil-wrapped treasure. A win could mean a rare indulgence, a loss, another night without sweetness. The games grew heated, voices rising, but always returning to laughter. For men who had lost almost everything, the stakes of chocolate became more meaningful than medals. Yet beneath the culture lay an unspoken tension. Every bite reminded them that the Allies had enough to spare, while families back home rationed bread. The more vibrant their camp culture became, the sharper the contrast with letters from Germany describing hunger and ruins. Morale here grew strangely detached from the war's outcome. Some prisoners felt comforted, others felt guilt. That contradiction soon twisted into a larger question. If prisoners were gaining weight and playing music, while civilians at home starved under bombardment, then who was truly breaking first?
The irony sharpened with every letter home. In the camps, some Germans put on weight, their faces fuller than when they were first captured. Parcels stacked neatly on tables, and guards encouraged regular meals. But in those letters, words from wives and mothers painted a different world. Bombed-out cities, ration lines, empty shelves. Families wrote of bread stretched with sawdust, of potatoes so scarce that children cried themselves to sleep. A Red Cross study later noted that many German POWs in American custody gained between 10 and 15 pounds during their captivity. The findings were clinical, statistical, but for the men inside the wire, it felt like betrayal of identity. To eat so well while their families starved was both relief and shame. One prisoner described sitting before a Red Cross parcel, unable to touch it. It was a shameful comfort, he admitted. He could hear his sister's words in his head, read off a scrap of censored paper. "We live on half rations now. Father grows thinner each day." Yet here he was, staring at a bar of chocolate he did not dare unwrap. The paradox created tension inside the camps. Some men consumed greedily, arguing that survival was duty. Others rationed parcels, hoarding them as though guilt could be measured in untouched tins. Even the music and chess games began to feel hollow, knowing that back home, neighbors scavenged rubble for food. It was not just hunger that split morale. It was the realization of imbalance. The Americans treated captives with more consistency than German leadership treated its own citizens. The shame festered in quiet conversations, men whispering at night about what it meant for the Reich's future. Could a nation that could not feed its people compete with one that fed its enemies? This inversion of morale was not lost on the guards. They watched the prisoners' faces tighten as new crates arrived, understanding that food could wound pride as deeply as hunger. And every new delivery reinforced the gulf between abundance and desperation. Yet letters carried more than shame. They carried fragments of connection, coded glimpses into collapsing lives back home. Prisoners clung to them even when the words underlined their guilt, because those words also anchored them to a world beyond the wire.
The mail call was both salvation and torment. Names were shouted in thick accents, envelopes passed hand to hand across the yard. German POWs clutched the fragile papers, their hands trembling more than they had in battle. Every letter had been read, stamped, and censored, yet even the blandest sentences carried enormous weight. One man unfolded a sheet where his mother's handwriting stumbled between lines. "We are safe. Food is scarce. We wait for news. He pressed the paper to his face, inhaling dust and ink as if the scent could bridge continents. Others read more carefully, scanning for coded hints between the clipped words. In 1944 alone, the International Red Cross facilitated nearly 15 million letters between prisoners and families. Each one was a thread across a chasm. But what startled families most were the fragments about food. A son wrote cautiously, "I eat chocolate here, sometimes even meat." A mother, sitting in a darkened kitchen in Cologne, read the line twice, unable to believe it. Her own cupboard held only a heel of stale bread. The disbelief cut deep. How could her son, a prisoner, eat better than she did in freedom? Prisoners wrestled with how much to reveal. Some exaggerated hardship to avoid resentment. Others let slip pieces of abundance, not realizing how alien it sounded. "They will never believe us back home," one man whispered after sealing a letter. He was right. The words seemed impossible, almost cruel when compared to bombed cities and ration cards. The censors ensured that no detailed descriptions passed through, but even vague sentences hinted at the truth. Families, reading between the lines, formed their own conclusions. Some accused returning letters of being propaganda planted by the Allies. Others clung to them as proof that at least their sons were alive and sheltered. In the barracks, men folded and refolded the thin paper until it tore at the creases. Letters were hidden in boots, under mattresses, even inside chocolate wrappers. They became more valuable than food because each one carried not just news, but the weight of disbelief. Yet that disbelief would only grow sharper when the men returned home. For if their families struggled to accept a line on paper, how would they react when former prisoners described entire parcels, entire orchestras, entire diets of abundance lived behind barbed wire?
The war ended, but for many prisoners, the hardest confrontation came not with guns, but with their own neighbors. In 1946, over 1.3 million German POWs gradually returned home, stepping off trains into cities they no longer recognized. Streets lay in ruins, roofs gaped open, and ration lines coiled around shattered buildings. Families wore faces carved by hunger and fear. Into this landscape of deprivation walked men who looked healthier, even fuller, than when they were captured. They told their stories carefully at first. Life behind barbed wire, work details, the parcels that arrived week after week. But when someone mentioned chocolate or music, the room often turned cold. Survivors of bombings could not fathom orchestras inside camps. Mothers who had boiled weeds for soup could not imagine their sons trading bars of cocoa for chess pieces. The gap between experience and memory became unbridgeable. Neighbors scoffed. "You lived too well," some said. "You were not prisoners, you were guests." The returning men tried to explain, but every detail sounded like betrayal. The shame returned, sharper than it had been in captivity. They had survived, sometimes even thrived, while millions at home had withered. One prisoner recalled standing in his village square as a crowd whispered that he had eaten American chocolate while they starved. His diary captured the bitterness. "We were treated like traitors for living too well." No defense seemed possible. Abundance in captivity had turned into guilt in freedom. The stigma was heavy. Many veterans kept silent, burying their memories of Red Cross parcels and chocolate bars. Others wrote cautiously, framing their experience as an indictment of the Reich's failures rather than a defense of Allied generosity. But the disbelief never fully faded. The contradiction between ruined homes and healthy returnees became a scar across communities. Still, within that scar lay the seed of reflection. If enemies had shown dignity and their own government had failed to feed its people, what did that mean for everything they had believed? For many, it was easier to stay silent than to face that question aloud. Yet silence could not erase the memory. And as the decades passed, the shame of abundance slowly transformed into something else, a symbol remembered not with guilt, but with fragile gratitude.
Time passed, and the silence began to crack. By the 1970s and 1980s, memoirs of former POWs appeared on shelves, written not to boast, but to wrestle with memory. Again and again, the same detail emerged in their pages: the taste of chocolate. Decades after the wire had rusted away, men still paused when describing the moment a Hershey bar landed on a table, the foil shining like a signal from another world. At reunions in Germany, white-haired veterans unwrapped chocolate bars brought by American guests. The ritual was simple: break, share, taste. Their faces softened into something both childlike and haunted. For them, it was not just candy, it was the reminder of an unexpected mercy, a fragment of humanity delivered in the middle of war. The statistics confirmed the immensity of it. By 1945, billions of individual rations, food parcels, cigarettes, tins of milk, and yes, millions of chocolate bars had been shipped under Geneva oversight. Numbers so vast they dwarfed the memories of individual men. Yet the power of a single bar lingered stronger than any column of figures. "It was the chocolate that told us we had lost," one veteran confessed in an interview. "Not the tanks or the bombers, but the realization that an enemy could treat prisoners with abundance, while Germany could not feed its own." The sweetness became a bitter truth. The Reich's collapse was measured not only in battlefields, but in breadlines. The legacy lived on quietly, carried in stories told to children and grandchildren. Some framed it as a lesson in dignity, others as a symbol of defeat. Either way, the memory endured longer than uniforms or medals. A foil wrapper outlasted a flag. In the end, what lingered was not propaganda, nor even logistics, but a taste. Sweet, fragile, unforgettable. It proved that even in war, compassion could be industrialized, delivered by the crate, and remembered for a lifetime. For the men who lived it, that sweetness would forever blur the line between captivity and kindness, turning chocolate into history's most unlikely witness.